Thomas Blackwood stood in his father's study, sunlight cutting through the window dust like accusations. 3 months since the funeral, and he still couldn't make sense of the papers covering the desk. Land deeds, cattle tallies in his foreman's cramped handwriting, survey maps showing creeks and pastures whose names meant nothing to him. The heat pressed against the windows, late July in Texas, and the air felt thick enough to chew. He picked up a leather-bound ledger, flipped through pages of numbers. His father had run this ranch for 37 years, built it from 2,000 acres to over 10,000. Thomas had spent those same years in Boston boarding schools, then Philadelphia, learning Greek and rhetoric and the proper way to hold a brandy glass. His father had visited twice, both times for less than a week. "You'll have choices," the old man had said during that final visit, when the cough was already rattling in his chest. "More than I ever did." Thomas set down the ledger and picked up an empty wooden bucket sitting on the corner of the desk. Odd thing to keep in an office, the wood was smooth, worn by hands and use, but there was nothing special about it. Just another piece of his father's life he didn't understand. Outside, voices speaking rapid Spanish, laughter, the sound of horses being led to water. Thomas walked to the window and looked down at 3 vaqueros working in the yard. He didn't know their names, didn't know which cattle they were responsible for, or why they were repairing that particular section of fence, or what they'd been discussing with such animation. He owned them, in a sense, employed them, at least. But he couldn't have told you the first thing about what made a good vaquero, or how to earn their respect. A flutter of movement caught his eye. Dust rising on the eastern horizon, growing larger. Someone riding hard toward the ranch house. Thomas set down the bucket and watched the rider approach, a thin thread of unease working its way up his spine. The foreman's funeral was a sparse affair. 12 people gathered at the small cemetery on the ranch's northern edge, where mesquite trees cast inadequate shade over weathered headstones. Jacob Mitchell had worked this land for 23 years, but Thomas barely knew him. An old man with a gray beard who delivered reports Thomas pretended to understand, who took care of things so Thomas didn't have to. A horse had spooked. Mitchell had been thrown, dead before his head stopped bouncing. The preacher from town said words about dust and eternity. Thomas stood in his eastern suit, sweat running down his back, thinking about how quickly he needed to hire a replacement. He'd already sent inquiries to the Carver Ranch and the Morrison spread, asking if they could recommend an experienced man. After the last prayer, as people began drifting toward their horses, a woman stepped forward. Thomas had noticed her during the service 40s, maybe, with weathered brown skin and dark hair shot through with gray. She wore a simple black dress, and her hands were calloused in a way that spoke of rope and reins. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, "I'm Sarah Mitchell, Jacob's wife." "Mrs. Mitchell," Thomas removed his hat, "I'm very sorry for your loss. Your husband was—" "Jacob ran this ranch for your father for 23 years, she said, cutting through his condolence. "I rode with him every one of them, learned cattle, learned the land, learned water. You don't know cattle from cotton, and the drought's coming. I can smell it. You'll lose everything in 6 months without someone who knows this land." Thomas blinked at her directness. Several people nearby had stopped to listen. "I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Mitchell," he said carefully, "but I've already made arrangements to hire a man." She almost smiled. "Of course you have. Let me save you the trouble." "They won't send anyone. You're the greenhorn Blackwood, and they're hoping you'll fail so they can buy your land cheap when you give up." Heat crept up Thomas's neck. "Mrs. Mitchell, I understand you're grieving, but I really don't think—" "I'm not asking for charity," she said. "I'm offering to teach you. What it'll cost is your pride and your assumptions. If you're capable of paying that—" Someone coughed. Thomas was aware of the vaqueros watching, of the preacher's uncomfortable expression. "That's very generous," Thomas said, working to keep his voice even, "but I think what you need right now is time to mourn. Please, let me help with that." He reached into his jacket for his billfold. "Whatever expenses. I don't need your money." Sarah's voice could have cut glass. "You need teaching, but you're not ready to hear that yet." She turned and walked to a paint horse tied at the cemetery edge, swung into the saddle with the ease of long practice, and rode away without looking back. 2 days later, Thomas received polite refusals from both neighboring ranches. Neither could spare an experienced foreman, perhaps in the fall, when the work slowed. Perhaps. He sat on the porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and red, and saw Sarah Mitchell riding up the long drive to his house. She stopped at the porch steps but didn't dismount. "Changed your mind?" she asked. "Not yet." Thomas said, "You will," Sarah said, and turned her horse back toward the small foreman's cabin at the ranch's edge. The heat got worse. Thomas tried to manage alone, calling the vaqueros to the main house each morning to issue instructions. They listened politely, nodded, said, "Si, patron," and then went about their work in ways that bore no resemblance to what he'd asked. On the 14th day, he found 3 cattle dead near a dried creek bed. Their bodies were bloated, tongues swollen black. He stared at them, sweat running into his eyes, and realized he had no idea why they died or how to prevent it from happening again. He rode to Sarah Mitchell's cabin as the sun was setting. She was packing, loading saddlebags with what looked like her entire life. "Mrs. Mitchell," she turned. "Mr. Blackwood, those cattle by Dry Creek, what killed them?" "Dehydration and bloat. The creek's been dry for 3 weeks. They tried to eat plants their bodies can't process when there's no water. Kills them slow." Thomas dismounted. "I need your help." "Need help or need someone to fix your problems while you watch? I'm asking you to teach me." The words felt like pulling teeth. "To show me what I don't know." Sarah studied him, her dark eyes unreadable in the fading light. "3 conditions. First, you work, you don't watch, you don't supervise, you do. Second, you listen to the vaqueros. Miguel's been running cattle since before you were born. He knows more than both of us about how they think. Third, when I teach you something, you don't explain it back to me like you invented it. I've had enough men do that to last me a lifetime." "Agreed." All three. She disappeared into the cabin and returned with the wooden bucket from his father's desk. "Your father got this from my people 30 years ago. My grandfather made it for carrying water from hidden springs, the kind you don't put on maps, the kind you need to survive drought." She held it out. Thomas took it, the smooth wood warm in his hands. My grandfather taught my mother. My mother taught me. Jacob learned from me. Now I'll teach you. If you can stand being the stupidest person in the room for a while." "I've been the stupidest person in the room for 3 months," Thomas said. "I just didn't know it." "Now you do," Sarah said. "We start before dawn tomorrow. Bring the bucket." Sarah woke him at 4 in the morning by throwing pebbles at his bedroom window. Thomas stumbled outside to find her already mounted, a second horse saddled and waiting. "The land talks in the morning," she said, "before the heat drowns everything out." They rode east across pastures Thomas had never seen. Sarah pointed to birds circling above a rocky outcrop. "Doves. See how they fly that pattern? There's water underneath. Might be 50 feet down, but it's there. Mesquite roots will find it." She showed him how to read the way grass grew, how cattle moved at different times of day, why certain areas stayed greener than others. Every observation came with a lesson Thomas had never imagined. The land wasn't just dirt and property lines. It was a text written in stone and plant and animal behavior, and he'd been functionally illiterate his entire life. After 2 hours, they met Miguel leading a group of vaqueros toward the southern pasture. Sarah introduced them properly, Miguel Reyes, who'd started as a vaquero in Mexico and worked his way north, who knew cattle the way some men knew cards or whiskey. "Patron," Miguel said, respect in his voice that Thomas knew he hadn't earned. "Senora Mitchell says you want to learn?" "I do." Miguel showed him how to spot dehydration before it became critical, the way a cow's skin would tent when you pinched it, the sunken eyes, the lethargy that meant you were already too late. He explained herd behavior, how cattle followed leaders, how pushing them too hard scattered them and made them impossible to manage. Thomas made mistakes, rode too fast and spooked the animals he was trying to observe, misread signs that Miguel said were obvious, suggested solutions that would have made problems worse. By noon, exhausted and sunburned, Thomas asked Sarah why they didn't just buy feed from neighboring ranches to get through the drought. "They'd price gouge you into bankruptcy," she said. "Besides, that's not solving the problem. We find water or we lose the herd. Your father never bought feed in his life, and neither did Jacob. Where's the water? Hidden. My people knew this land before it had fences and property lines, before it had names written in English. There are springs that survive drought, fed by aquifers so deep they don't care about rain. Your father knew some of them. We'll find the rest. That evening, alone in his study, Thomas spread out his father's maps and tried to mark what he'd learned. Bird patterns here, mesquite roots there, but the paper couldn't capture it. The knowledge Sarah carried wasn't in documents. It was in her hands and eyes and the way she read slope and shadow. He owned 10,000 acres of a language he'd barely begun to learn. A month into their partnership, Sarah led Thomas to a canyon his maps didn't properly show. The survey had marked it as rough terrain, nothing more. But when they descended into the cut between red rock walls, Thomas heard water. 3 springs emerged from the canyon face, feeding a pool that stayed cool even in August heat. Sarah let the horses drink while Thomas stared at water that shouldn't exist. Your father knew about this place, Sarah said. Jacob brought him here once, back when I was pregnant with our daughter. He marked it on no map, told no one. He liked having secrets. You had a daughter. Fever took her at 6, long time ago. Sarah's voice stayed level. The springs, though, these survive drought because they're fed from deep. The aquifer's 60 feet down, maybe more. My grandfather showed my mother. My mother showed me. We rotate the herd through here every 3 days. Keeps them alive when the surface water dies. Over the next hour, as they watered cattle in small groups to avoid fouling the source, Sarah told Thomas about her life, her Apache mother, her white father who'd been a scout, how both communities rejected their marriage, forcing them to build knowledge from 2 worlds or starve, how Sarah had grown up reading sign in 2 languages, understanding land through her mother's people and cattle through her father's work. Why didn't Jacob tell me about the springs? Thomas asked, or any of this? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching cattle drink. Your father didn't want you to know. Jacob told me that once, after he'd been drinking. He said your father kept you ignorant on purpose, thought if you really knew the ranch the way we did, you'd feel trapped by it, want to stay when you should have the choice to leave. He wanted you to have choices. Thomas felt something crack in his chest, his father's cold distance, the brief visits, the lack of teaching. It had all been a twisted form of love, trying to free him from the land by making sure he never learned to love it. The vaqueros, Sarah continued, the former slaves working the southern pastures. Your father paid them, but he never respected them, treated them like tools. Jacob and I balanced that as best we could, tried to show them someone saw them as men, but your father's reputation stuck. And now you choose what kind of owner you'll be, the kind who pays wages and demands work, or the kind who understands that the best knowledge on this ranch isn't in your study. It's in the hands of people who've been here longer than you've been alive. Thomas looked at the springs, water flowing from stone, fed by sources older than any claim or deed. Teach me to be the second kind, he said. The railroad men arrived in a fancy carriage, leather seats and brass fittings that looked obscene in the dusty ranch yard. 2 of them, wearing suits that cost more than Miguel made in a year. They wanted Thomas's land for a rail line connecting San Antonio to El Paso. Their offer was exactly half what the ranch was worth, and they delivered it like they were doing him a favor. Thomas sat across from them in his father's study, the maps and deeds spread between them like a test he'd finally learned to pass. That's insulting, he said. The older one, Garrison, smiled. Mr. Blackwood, with all respect, you're not a rancher. You're a young man who inherited property you don't know how to run. The drought's going to break you. We're offering you a way out before that happens. The drought's manageable if you know the land. And do you, the younger one, Peters leaned forward, because from what we hear that you're playing rancher with an Indian woman and a bunch of Mexicans. That's not a business. That's a curiosity. Thomas stood. We're done here. Garrison didn't move. We have political connections. Mr. Blackwood, permits you'll need, water rights that could become complicated. Make this easy on yourself. Get off my land. They left, but their threats hung in the air like smoke. 2 days later, Thomas rode to the Carver Ranch to discuss sharing water access during the worst of the drought. Richard Carver met him on the porch, didn't invite him inside. "Heard you turned down the railroad," Carver said. "I did." Carver laughed, a mean sound. "You're playing rancher with a squaw teacher and a bunch of Mexicans. This ain't a game for Eastern school types. Boy, sell out while you can. Nobody here's going to help you pretend you're one of us." Thomas rode home slowly, the social isolation settling over him like a net. That evening, he found Sarah checking fence line near the main house. "Am I being foolish?" he asked. She straightened, wiped sweat from her forehead. "Foolish would be thinking those men respect you just because you're white like them. They don't. They see you as weak, and they're waiting for you to prove them right. So what do I do?" "You earn respect by knowing the land and treating people fairly. You're halfway there." She met his eyes. "The second half's harder. It means making choices that'll cost you." "What kind of choices?" "The kind that separate who you are from who your father was. The kind that lose you friends you probably shouldn't have had in the first place." Thomas looked out at his land, at the cattle moving slowly across the pasture, at the sky turning purple and orange with sunset. "I'm already losing them," he said. "Then you might as well lose them for the right reasons," Sarah said. The drought reached its peak in mid-September. 2 more cattle died despite rotating through the canyon springs. The herd was too large for the available water. Thomas sat in his study late at night, doing calculations that all led to the same conclusion. He could sell half the herd at catastrophic loss, or he could gamble everything on rain that might not come. Sarah appeared in the doorway at dawn. "There's one more option." "What?" "There's a spring on Apache land, just over the southern border of your property, bigger than the canyon springs. My mother's cousin, Neshoba, controls access to it. He might grant permission if I ask." "Then ask. You need to understand what it means. You'd owe a debt to people your father despised and ignored, people the Army tried to wipe out 30 years ago. You'd have to treat them as neighbors, not as obstacles or threats." Thomas thought about his father's maps, the careful survey lines that turned land into property. He thought about the empty bucket, about Sarah's teaching, about Miguel's quiet competence. He thought about Carver's laughter and the railroad men's threats and the neighboring ranches that had frozen him out. "How do I treat people I've never met as neighbors? You meet them as men, not as problems. You listen to their conditions. You accept that some things can't be bought or controlled, only earned through respect." Thomas stood and walked to the window, the same view as 3 months ago. But now he could read it. He could see where water pooled after rain, where cattle preferred to graze, where the land spoke in languages his maps had never captured. "Ask your cousin," he said. "Tell him I want to meet him properly, not as owner to supplier, but as neighbor to neighbor." Sarah studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll send word." That night, Thomas sat in his father's study surrounded by land deeds and ownership papers, and understood for the first time how completely worthless they were. All that paper, all those careful surveys and legal descriptions, and they couldn't find a single drop of water or teach him how to read the sky for rain or show him which plants cattle could safely eat. The knowledge that mattered wasn't in his study. It was in Sarah's hands, and Miguel's observations, and the generational wisdom of people his father had treated as less than human. He gathered the deeds into a pile, then spread them out again. They'd be needed, eventually. But they were tools, not answers. The answers required relationships his privilege had taught him to dismiss. Neshoba arrived 3 days later with 3 young Apache men, all of them riding with the easy grace of people who'd been born on horseback. Thomas met them in the yard, not the study. He'd learned that much, at least. "Mr. Neshoba," Thomas said, "thank you for coming." The older man dismounted. His face was weathered like carved wood, his dark eyes measuring. "Sarah says you're learning. My mother knew your grandfather. He was fair to our people before the Army drove us out. Your father was different." "My father made mistakes," Thomas said. "I'm trying not to repeat them." "Words are easy. Sarah tells me you want access to the southern spring. I do, but I'm asking, not demanding." Neshoba's expression didn't change. "The spring has been ours for longer than your people have had words for this land. It feeds from an aquifer 70 feet down, never dries. My grandfather showed it to my mother. My mother showed it to me. Sarah told me. What will you give for access? Thomas had thought about this. What do you want? 2 of my men employed as water guardians. Year-round work, fair wages, the spring area never fenced, and my people keep access whenever we need it. Agreed. Neshoba studied him. You agree quickly. Because it's fair, and because I've learned that the best knowledge on this ranch doesn't come from ownership papers. Something shifted in Neshoba's expression. Not quite a smile, but a softening. Sarah chose well when she decided to teach you. Let's see if you can learn the rest. They moved the herd to the southern pasture over the next 2 days. The spring emerged from a rocky hillside, creating a pool 20 feet across and deep enough that Thomas couldn't see the bottom. Water flowed constantly, clear and cold. Cattle drank in groups while Neshoba's men managed the rotation with practiced efficiency. Miguel approached Thomas on the second day. You're becoming a real rancher, patron. Not because you own this, because you know how to keep it alive. That night, rain came. Not a downpour, but steady enough that the land drank it in. Thomas stood in it with Sarah, both of them soaked and exhausted. What happens now? He asked. Now you decide if you're brave enough to make this partnership official, she said. The kind on paper, not just in practice. I mean making me co-owner with equal authority. I mean scandalizing everyone who thinks a woman, especially a half-Apache woman, shouldn't own land. Thomas looked at the cattle, at the rain falling on parched earth, at the spring flowing from depths his maps had never imagined. I'll have the papers drawn up tomorrow, he said. Thomas stood in his father's study, the same room where he'd started 3 months ago. But he saw it differently now. The land deeds were spread across the desk, partnership papers laid on top of them, Sarah's name next to his, equal authority, equal ownership. His lawyer sat across from him, uncomfortable. Mr. Blackwood, you need to understand the consequences. Society won't accept this. You'll be ostracized. Business partnerships with women are one thing, but this, with someone who's... He didn't finish. Someone who's half Apache, Thomas said. Someone who knows this land better than any white rancher in the county. Someone who kept this ranch alive while I was learning which end of a cow was which. I'm just saying, there will be costs. Thomas picked up the pen. There are always costs. The question is whether you're paying for the right things. He signed. Sarah signed beside him. The lawyer left, shaking his head. The neighboring ranchers reacted exactly as predicted. Invitations stopped. Business relationships cooled. When Thomas rode into town, men turned away or looked through him like glass. Richard Carver crossed the street rather than acknowledge him. But the ranch thrived. The vaqueros worked with new energy under Sarah's recognized leadership. The former slaves on the southern pasture received profit-sharing Thomas established, a percentage of cattle sales that gave them stake in the land's success. Miguel became foreman officially, a title he'd held in practice for years. 2 of Neshoba's men stayed on as water guardians, teaching Thomas more about reading land through Apache knowledge passed down through generations. The ranch became a strange hybrid Mexican vaqueros, former slaves, Apache water guardians, and 2 owners who scandalized everyone. The railroad returned in November with a higher offer. Thomas refused again. This land isn't for sale, he told them. I finally understand what it's worth. After they left, Sarah asked him if he regretted the social cost. Thomas picked up the wooden bucket from its shelf, now filled with seeds for next season's planting. My father tried to teach me that ownership was enough, that having papers meant having power. You taught me that it means nothing without understanding and respect. I'd rather be a real rancher that society mocks than a fake one they accept. Your father would have hated this, Sarah said. My father kept me ignorant because he thought it was kindness. Turns out ignorance was the cruelest thing he could have given me. Thomas set down the bucket. I'm done with his kind of kindness. They rode out at dawn to check the herd. The same horizon Thomas had looked at 3 months ago when he'd understood nothing. The cattle moved slowly across the pasture, healthy despite the drought. The sky was clear, promising another hot day, but there was moisture in the soil now. Rain had come, more would come. Sarah rode beside him, equal partner, equal owner. Miguel and two vaqueros worked fence line in the distance. Neshoba's men checked the southern spring. Former slaves tended cattle in the far pasture. The ranch was a community now, not a kingdom. Thomas pulled his horse to a stop and looked out at the land, the same 10,000 acres, the same Texas sky. But he could read it now. He knew where water hid beneath stone, how cattle thought, what plants meant survival and which meant death. He knew the names of every man who worked this land and what they brought to it. The ownership papers in his study meant something now, not because they gave him power, but because he'd finally learned what they demanded in return: understanding, respect, humility. Sarah stopped beside him. "What are you thinking?" "That I finally earned this," Thomas said. "Not the land, the right to try to take care of it." "Took you long enough. Some of us are slow learners." Sarah almost smiled. "Some of us just needed better teachers." They rode on together across land Thomas now understood wasn't his to control, only his to serve. The morning spread before them, full of work that would never end but finally made sense. He was a rancher now, not because he'd inherited papers, but because he'd learned to read the deeper text written in water and stone and the wisdom of people his privilege had taught him to ignore. The bucket was full, the springs flowed, the land spoke in languages he was finally beginning to understand. And that, Thomas thought, was worth every friend he'd lost and every door that had closed in his face.